In this video, we're going to build an IP grabber with Remix and Mantine UI. So what will you learn by watching this video? You're going to get a basic overview of Remix. You're going to learn about Remix's action and loader functions, and these are really cool, and these are pretty unique to Remix. And you're going to learn about using TypeScript with Remix. So firstly, what is an IP grabber? Well, you're going to be able to create a short URL, and then someone clicks that short URL, and it records the person's IP address and then redirects them. And you may be wondering, is this an invasion of privacy? And the answer is yes. I don't suggest that you actually make this application and use this to grab people's IP addresses. So let's get started with a demo. So we have a simple input form here, and we can just put in a URL to redirect to, and then we can click create track. And we come to this page here and we can copy this link. And if we go to this link in a new tab, you can see that we have a short URL here. And when we click on this, we get a loading spinner, and then we get redirected to our redirect URL. If we come back to the main page here and refresh, you can see that we've recorded a date that the URL was clicked, and we've recorded the IP address of the person that clicked the link. We can open this a bunch more times here and refresh, and you can see that we have a bunch more instances of the URL being clicked. So let's get started bootstrapping this application. With all of my tutorials, you'll find a link to the GitHub repository in the description below. And inside of that repository, you'll see a notes markdown file. And inside of that file, there's a bunch of commands that we're going to use throughout the tutorial. And you can copy these commands to make following along a little bit easier. The first command we're going to use is npx create remix, and we're going to use @latest. So the first question is, where would you like to create the app? I'm going to call mine IP grabber. And then I'm just going to start off with just the basics. And then I'm going to use the Remix app server. Would you like to npm install? No, because I'm going to use yarn instead. And here you can choose just JavaScript or TypeScript. I'm going to choose TypeScript. Next, we can cd into our application, and I can open it up in VS Code. The first thing I'm going to do is to install some dependencies. So we have Prisma here, we have Mantine hooks, Mantine core, Mantine SSR, Nano ID, and Prisma. Let's install those. Once the dependencies have finished installing, we can initialize Prisma, and I'm going to be using SQLite. You can obviously use Postgres or MySQL if you prefer, but SQLite is really handy for developing locally. And this command is going to create this Prisma folder here, and this is going to have your schema.prisma. And then once you create your database, you're also going to have a database file in here if you're using SQLite. I'm going to start by defining my application schema. So the first model we're going to have is a track. So I'm going to say model track. And our track is going to have an ID, and that is going to be a string. I'm going to say @ID, and then I'm going to say @default is UUID, and this is going to generate a UUID for us. I'm going to have created at. This is going to be of type datetime, and the default is going to be now. I'm going to have updated at. This is going to be a datetime as well, and this is going to be updated at. And so the default for created at is not at now, it's just now. Same as updated at. Then we're going to have a redirect URL, and this is just going to be a string. Next, we're going to have a track ID, and this is going to be a string, and we're going to add a unique constraint to this as well. So we're going to generate this track ID when we create a track, and we're going to use Nano ID to create a relatively short ID instead of using the UUID, because that is quite long. The next model I'm going to have is clicks, and this is going to be an array of clicks that live on the track. So when somebody clicks a URL, it's going to add to that array. I'm going to say model click. We're going to have an ID, which is going to be a string. It's going to be of type ID. And we're going to say @default is UUID. We're going to have created at, going to be datetime, and the default is going to be now. And this is @default. I'm not going to put updated on this model because you can't technically update a click. It's a user agent, and this is going to be a string. I'm going to have an IP address, and this is going to be a string. And next, we need to join our clicks onto our track. So on track, I'm going to say clicks is an array of click. And we're getting an error here, and that's because the clicks model is missing our track. So let's add that. I say track is of type track, and it's going to have a relation for fields track ID, and the reference is going to reference tracks ID. So we can put ID in the reference. And it says now we're missing a track ID, so let's add that. Track ID is a string. So don't get confused by this track ID and this track ID up here. So this track ID up here is just a short ID that we're going to use instead of this larger UUID. And that's so the URLs aren't so long. But the track ID on click is a reference to our tracks ID. Okay, so let's run this npx prisma db push. And this is going to create our db file for us. So you can see here we have dev.db. So the next thing to do is to set up our Prisma instance. So come inside of the app folder here, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this utils. And inside of this, I'm going to say db.server.ts. And it's important that you have this server here, and this is going to tell React that this is a server component and it's to only ever be run on the server. Let's import Prisma client from Prisma client. I'm going to say function get db. And this is going to return an instance of Prisma client. I'm going to say if process.env.nodeEnv is equal to production, then we simply want to return new Prisma client. If we're not working in production, then we want to add DB to a global instance. Let's say if not global dot underscore underscore DB, then global dot underscore underscore DB is equal to new Prisma client. And then we're just going to return global dot underscore underscore DB. Next, let's say const DB is equal to get DB. Then we're going to export DB. And you notice we have an error here. TypeScript is complaining to us because underscore underscore DB does not exist on type global. So we can declare this by saying declare global. I'm going to say var underscore underscore DB is Prisma client or undefined. And now TypeScript is happy. So the next thing to do is to configure Mantine UI. So this is really easy. And if you've done this with Next, it's actually much easier with Remix. So come into entry.server, and I'm going to import inject style into static markup from Mantine SSR. And then down here where we return a new response, we're just going to wrap our markup in this function. And then we're done. That is Mantine UI configured. Okay, so let's start our application, yarn dev. I'm going to move this window to the side. I'm going to bring my browser over. And you can see that we just have a few links here and basically an empty page. Let's come into the routes folder, and you can see we have index here. And index corresponds with what we see on this page. So on our index is where we're going to build our form to create the short URL. So I'm going to remove all of this that we have here. And I'm going to start off with a container. And container comes from Mantine core. I'm going to have a form element, and form comes from remix run/react. And inside of that form, I'm going to have one text input. And we can save this. And as you would expect with a modern framework, you get fast hot reloading here. I'm going to say the size is XL. The placeholder is going to be https:/google.com. The label is going to be redirect URL. I'm going to say this is required. The name is going to be redirect URL. And I'm going to give this a style of flex1. And the type is going to be URL. And this is going to give us some validation. If we have a look at the input markup, you can see here that we have a type of URL. And this means that we're going to have to put in a valid URL. So let's add a button and try to submit this form without a valid URL. I'm going to have a button, and this is going to come from Mantine core. I'm going to say this button is going to have a margin left of medium. Its size is going to be XL to match our input. The type is going to be submit. And then let's give this a label of create tracker. Okay, so let's add some styles to our form so the button sits to the right of our input. I'm going to say style is equal to display flex. And then it's a little bit misaligned here. So let's align items to flex end. So I'm going to say align items flex end. And this is now sitting nicely. Let's try submit this without a valid URL. And you can see here, please enter a URL. So you need the protocol on the start of the URL here. And this is going to give our form some really nice validation. And we get that out of the box just with standard HTML. One of the things you'll notice about Remix is that it relies pretty heavily on standard HTML, which makes developing your applications much easier. And it means that they're just going to work across lots of devices without little edge cases. So there's one last thing that we need to add to our form. We just need to add a method here, and the method is going to be post. Now we can add a handler to our form. So in Remix, when you post to this route, you can have an action. So I'm going to say export const action is equal to an async function. And this action is going to have a type of action function. And then we can get the form data and submit the form inside of this action. And this setup reminds me a lot of PHP because this action is only ever going to run on the server when you post to this route, and Remix is going to handle all this logic for you. So we can get the form data by saying const form is equal to await request dot form data. And we need to put request inside of our arguments here. And our arguments here are actually an object, and request is the name of the property inside of the object. Next, we can get our redirect URL input from our form data. So I can say const redirect URL is equal to form.get. And then we can get properties of our form by their name. We need to add a little bit of validation. So if the redirect URL is empty, then we throw an error. So I'm going to say if type of redirect URL is not equal to a string, throw new error, invalid redirect URL. Otherwise, we can generate a fields object. So I'm going to say const fields is equal to an object with redirect URL. And we need to add a track ID in here. So track ID, and I'm just going to say this is 1 for now. We can generate this with nano ID in just a second. But then the next thing we need to do is to create our track with this fields input. So I'm going to say const track is equal to await db.track.create. And then we can give it some data, and the data is going to be our fields. And this DB has been imported from utils/db.server. After we created our track, we don't want to do a redirect to the page where we can view all the clicks for that track. So we can return redirect, and this comes from remix/node, and then we can put in a URL to redirect to. So I'm going to say tracks/track.track ID. Okay, so let's generate this track ID with nano ID. So I'm going to import from nano ID, and I'm going to import custom alphabet. Then you say const nano ID is equal to custom alphabet. And then I'm going to put in a string of all the letters and numbers that we can use to generate an ID. So this is just everything from A through to Z, and then all of the numbers. And then I just want my track ID to be 10 characters long. Let's use nano ID down here. And then we're going to generate the track ID with nano ID. So we have a little warning up here, and it's saying import action function is only used as a type. So we can move our redirect out of this import, and then we can just import action function as a type by saying import type action function. Let's try this. I'm going to try create a redirect URL with google.com. Click track, and we get a 404. Let's start Prisma Studio so we can see what data we have in the database. So I'm going to type npx Prisma Studio, and this is going to open up Prisma Studio for us. And we can see that we already have one track here. And this is the track that we created. So we have google.com, and then we have a short track ID here. So next, let's make the page where we can track a redirect. So inside of our routes folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to name this file $trackid.tsx. And the $ here indicates that the page is going to be a dynamically routed page. So the URL is going to be my domain /track ID. And if they type in this, they're going to land on this page here. So I'm going to say export default function track route, and I'm going to return a fragment. And inside of that fragment, I'm going to have a form. And I want to have a form because I want to make sure that I track the IP address on the client. So you'll see what I mean in just a second. So I'm going to have another form element here. And inside of that form, I'm just going to have an input. The name is going to be IP, and the default value is going to be IP. So we need to create this IP here. So I'm going to say const is equal to use state, and use state, of course, comes from React. I'm going to call this variable IP, and we're going to have a setter called set IP. Okay, so we're going to need to fetch the user's IP address, and we can make a request to a URL that is ipify.org. So I'm going to say use effect, and then we're going to have an empty dependency list here. And I'm going to say fetch, and I'm going to fetch the IP address from api.ipify.org, and I want the format in JSON. So if we go to this route, you can see that it returns a JSON with one property, and that value is going to be the IP address from the user that made this request. So we're going to get this user to make a request to this route here, and then it's going to return their IP address. So then we need to call .then. We're going to get the response. We're going to return the response.json. We're going to call .then again. We're going to get the response of JSON. And then we're going to set IP. So set IP res.ip. Okay, so now we're going to have the IP address, and let's put this in our form. So we can go back to our application, and we can remove tracks from the URL here. So we just go to our track, and you can see that after a couple of seconds, we get the IP address, and it fills in the form with our IP address. So we don't want the user to see this form. So I'm going to add a loader. So loader comes from Mantine core. So we have this spinner here. On our form, I'm going to say the method is post. I'm going to say that it's hidden. And then once we've got the IP address, we want to submit this form. So let's add another use effect hook here. So I'm going to say use effect. And this use effect is going to have the IP address in the dependency list. And we're going to say if IP, then we want to submit this form. So let's use a ref to get the form, and then we can call .submit on that ref. So I'm going to say const form ref is equal to use ref, which of course comes from React, and it's going to default to null. And we can type this ref as HTML form, element. Then we add this ref to the form. So ref equals, add the ref. And then we can say formRef.current.submit. Okay, so now we're getting a 405 method not allowed. And that's because we don't have a handler to handle our form submit. So let's add an action. Export const action. And this is going to be of type action function. Remember to import this as type equal to async. And we're going to get a couple of parameters here. So we have an object. The first parameter is our request. And the next one is our params. And inside of the params, we're going to have our track ID. So we need to find our track by the track ID because we need to get the redirect URL. I'm going to say const track is equal to await db dot track dot find unique where track ID is equal to params dot track ID. And we want to select redirect URL, it's true. Next, we need to test to see if our track actually exists. So I'm going to say if not track, then we want to throw an error. So throw new error track params.track ID does not exist. And next we're going to get our form data. So I'm going to say const form is equal to await request dot form data. Then we need to get our IP address out of the form data. So const IP is equal to form.get. And we want to get IP. Just a note on grabbing the IP, there's lots of different ways you can do this. One of the better ways to do this would be to use the request headers. And if you have a proxy sitting in front of your application, such as Nginx, then you're going to be able to get the X forwarded for address from the request. But we don't have that here. And so this is our best option to reliably get an IP address. And next we need to test that the type of IP is string. So I'm going to say if type of IP is not equal to string, then we need to throw an error, throw new error, missing user data. And we also want to get the user agent. Luckily, the user agent does exist in the request headers. So I'm going to say const user agent is equal to request.headers, and then we can call .get, and then we can get the property by its name, and the name of the user agent is user-agent. Okay, so let's construct our fields object. So const fields is equal to a new object. We're going to add a user agent. We're going to add our IP address. We're going to add the track ID of track.id. And we need to select ID from track. We didn't do that. The ID is true. And Prisma's going to type all this for you. So if you have select as true, then your type is going to include the ID, which is really nice. Okay, so let's create our clip. So I'm going to say await db dot click dot create. I'm going to pass in our data, and our data is going to be our fields. And next, we want to redirect to the redirect URL from the track. So I'm going to return redirect track dot redirect URL. And TypeScript is complaining here because we haven't checked that the user agent is a string. So let's do that really quickly. We can just copy this check. Then we can say if type of user agent is not equal a string, then we can say missing user data, and that's a good error message. Okay, so let's refresh this page here. And we get redirected back to Google. Let's check Prisma Studio for clicks. And you can see that we have one click here. Let's go back to tracks and refresh this. And you can see this track now has one click. So let's build out our user interface to show the clicks for the track. So I just want to set the URL for this as /tracks/track ID. So inside of routes, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this folder tracks. And then I'm going to create a new file inside of tracks and I'm going to call this $trackid.tsx. So if this was confusing for you, you could create a new folder in here, for example, and call this T. And then inside of your T folder here, you could move this track ID. And then when you redirect, it's going to be /t/random track ID instead of just root domain /random track ID. I'm going to move this back out into my routes and I'm going to delete this T folder. So inside of our track file, I'm going to export default track route. And I'm just going to return a div that says hello. And this is going to export default function. Okay, so let's go to this page by creating a new track and we get our hello here. So I need to load in the track and all the clicks. So to do this, Remix provides us with another handy function called loader. So I'm going to export const loader, and this is going to be of type loader function is equal to an async function. And our async function takes some arguments, and the first argument is params. Make sure you spell loader correctly. The spelling of these functions is important. And remember, we need to import this as a type. Let's find our track. So const track is equal to await db.track.find unique, where track ID is equal to params.trackID. I want to select a few fields. Track ID, true. Then I want to get the clicks. And you can just say clicks is true, and it's just going to select everything and order in the default order. But I want to provide an object, and I want to say order by, and I want to order my clicks by they created at, and I want to order them in descending order. The order by is going to be an array that takes an object, and you can order by different fields. So I'm just going to have one property in my array. You could have several fields, and it's just going to go through the array and order by your first object and then your second object and so on. And the key is the field that you want to order by, and then the value is how you want to order them. So either ascending or descending. So we're getting an error here, and this is because we haven't returned anything from our loader function, which is fine. We'll get there. Next, we need to test to see if our track is valid. So I'm going to say if not track, then throw new error track params.trackID does not exist. Otherwise, we just want to return the data from our loader function. I'm going to say const data is equal to our track. Then we want to return JSON data. And we can type out this data. So let's create a new interface or type. I'm going to say type loader data is equal to track. Then we're going to have a track ID. This is going to be a string. We're going to have clicks, and this is going to be an array of click. And then let's type this data here. So we need to import these as types again, except for JSON, because we're actually using JSON as a function. Let's create two imports, one for type and one for just JSON. Now down inside of our function, we can use this data. And to get this data, we can use the use loader data. So I'm going to say const data is equal to use loader data. And then we can type this as loader data. This is the type we created earlier. And now we get a nice type on our data field here. Let's JSON stringify this to the DOM so we can see what's in this. And we get some data here, and we have 0 clicks, of course. So we'll add a link that we can easily click, so then we can generate some click data. So we can say A, and then the anchor text is just going to be test, and the href is going to be a string that is /data.track.trackID. Click this a bunch of times, and it should redirect to our destination each time. My internet is a little bit slow because I have a VPN, so you weirdos can't see my IP address. Okay, so we just want to display this data inside of a nice table from Mantine UI. To remove this stringify here, and I'm going to get a table from Mantine UI. Need to import table from @Mantine core. Our table is going to have a T head, which is just the table head. And then inside of the table head, we're going to have a row. And then we're going to have some columns. The first column is going to be date. The next one is going to be our user agent. And then the last one is just going to be our IP address. Okay, so let's generate our rows data. So I'm going to say const rows is equal to data.track.clicks.map. And we just need to format our clicks into something that's going to fit into our table. So I'm just going to return a new table row. And inside of that table row, we're going to have a TD. We're going to have a few TDs actually. We need a key here, of course. So key equal to click.id. So the first column is going to be a date. So to format this date, we can say new date click.createdApp .to local date string. And then we can pass some properties in here. The first one is going to be an empty array. And then the second one is going to be 12-hour time. And that's going to be true. And this just means we're going to format it in 12-hour time instead of 24-hour time. Then the next row is going to be our click.userAgent. And then the last one is going to be our click.IP. And then we just need to render our rows. So inside of the table, under the table head, we can have a T body. And then inside of the table body, we can have our rows. And now we have all the clicks that we've recorded from our IP grabber. The last cool thing that I want to show you is something from Mantine UI. And this is the use clipboard hook. So I'm going to say const clipboard is equal to use clipboard. And then I'm going to have a timeout of 500. And just above the table, I'm going to have a button. And I'm going to get the button from Mantine core. And I'm just going to add some text to this. So I'm going to say clipboard.copied. Then the text is going to be copied. Otherwise, the text is going to be copy. We're going to have a color, and the color is going to be clipboard.copied. Then the button color is going to be teal. Otherwise, it's going to be blue. And then on click, we're going to have a function. And this function is going to call clipboard.copy. And the text that it's going to copy is our redirect URL. So I'm just going to get the origin from the window object. So I'm going to say window.location.origin, and then it's going to be /data.track.track ID. So when we click this button here, it says copied, and then we have the track ID copied to our clipboard. This window.location.origin is quite reliable, but you'll probably want to replace it with an environment variable. And the reason that you need that is because if you just add the track ID, of course, what they're just going to copy is just the track ID, and then they're going to paste that into a message to send to somebody, and it's not actually going to be a valid URL. So that is how to make a basic IP grabber with Remix and Mantine UI. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to the channel and you've given this video a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.